Yeah. Hi, Mr. Peter Lee. Please do tell us about how this passion of yours, came about in creating this exhibition here in Singapore about the Peranakan sarongs and the kebayas here.
Yeah. Well, I would say my interest of mine from childhood was history. I was always fascinated with history books and about the past. And initially, of course, when I was a child, the books available were all to do with English history mostly. So I was reading all about Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth. And I suppose as I got older, history also became very tied with my own sense of origin, where my family came from. And I had all these questions, and I used to interview my grandmother and about where our family came from, and this led to me in the 1980s going to China to find my family roots, which I managed to trace. And when my ancestor came back, as a university student, I was a backpacker, and I went to Fujian and found the village and the house, and we found the ancestral book and all these details. So I've always been fascinated by origins, and I found that studying these things firsthand allowed me to form a much clearer picture of where I came from and where something originated. So with Sarong Kebaya, again, it started as something which my grandmother wore, and my aunt gave me a few pieces of her batiks and kebayas. And of course, it's something my mother wears as well. And I used to travel and occasionally see an antique shop or something and pick out something for my mother, and she is a collector as well. So I caught the collecting bug from her, and began mostly trying to find pieces for her, and then that led to just a curiosity about where this costume came from, how it developed. And I increasingly found from asking collectors that the information was very still not very precise, and the answers didn't totally satisfy me. So thus began a journey trying to really discover the roots. And then it just took off from there. And of course, even for Peranakan studies, the emphasis has been 20th century up to the late 19th century. But the Chinese have been in Southeast Asia at least since the early 17th century. So there's a huge gap with origins. And of course, in order to look earlier, you have to go back to the Dutch colonial period and the Portuguese colonial period. So it took me to reading books on these areas and to speaking to scholars and collectors, and also for textile scholars as well as history scholars. So combining these things, I was able to form sort of interesting and fascinating picture of how this costume developed.
I understand that you are Peranakan yourself, Mr. Peter Lee. Could you tell us what is a Peranakan identity and the culture? Because there's so much that's going on around Asia. That the past has actually hidden from us, such as you have the Peranakan community in Penang, you have Peranakan community in India, right? And as well as Philippines and also in Indonesia. Could you elaborate on this issue?
Well, firstly, I would say, from among sort of in the academic world, the word Peranakan is not used beyond Malaysia and Indonesia. I mean, for the Chinese community in Malaysia and Indonesia. So we strictly don't really speak about the Peranakans in the Philippines. We do say the mixed race communities in these other countries, The term Peranakan, I think, refers more strictly to Malaysia, Indonesia, and more recently to the Peranakan communities in Phuket and in Yangon, mainly because they have their origins are strongly linked to the Peranakan community of Penang. So the term has been extended to these places as well. Now back to your question about identity, I would say it's really difficult for me to answer this in a short manner. It has been evolving. It's not what it is what is often described or showcased is something from the past, and even what the community was like in 1800 was very different from 1900 and the year 2000. But I would say, but one thread running through it is that the community definitely had certain roots, and the roots are of southern Chinese immigrants to the Malay archipelago, and and developing a community in this region. The first wives were freed slaves, or who usually from Batak or Balinese. But you didn't need so many to form a community, because their daughters and sons and daughters would all have Chinese names. They would be mixed race, but usually the pattern was at that period they would the children of such mixed race marriages would marry other Chinese. So it increasingly, they all had Chinese names and sort of religious practices. So that's how the community came about. But over the since the 17th century, when this phenomenon began in the colonial port towns, the experience within each town was different. So the way it evolved, its contact with other local communities was so different. So it's quite a varied history. So what happened in Penang was different from Malacca, from Singapore, from the language spoken, but you would see certain general trends, I would say. And one is, of course, was strong emphasis on ancestral respect and ceremonies, and then you see slowly the introduction of Christianity, and in fact a lot of Peranakans were involved in converting or the early Christianity in the region, but also the formation of political and national identities. So many issues. Today, a lot of people who self-identify themselves as Peranakan are interested somehow to preserve and promote this heritage. The cultural practices in themselves are not so interesting, not so important to me, because it varies from town to town. And even maybe what people did in Katong was not the same as Bukit Timah or whatever. So there was a lot of variation, but I think there's a certain ethos, and many of them were, for me, interesting because they were the first Chinese people to become westernized, and so they were sort of introducing Western ideas early. In that sense, they were pioneers in many respects. They were also very interested in community and in nation building. So in that sense, they were very visionary to me, which is another inspiring aspect of it. So with this donation, I think, and the exhibition, I think the aim is to sort of emulate that kind of behavior.
What's next for the Peranakan community? Is the sarong and the kebaya or the batik culture, is it going to be passed on to the next generation, or would there be a new fashion exposure?
Well, I think for anything to evolve properly, there needs to be a proper understanding. If you want to move forward correctly, you must understand where it came from. So hopefully an exhibition like this, which presents the history, will inspire people to react to the history by creating something new. if you know where it came from, then you know how to make it new. So a modern response, or something modern or new, always is a response to something old. So yeah, I think, and I wish that this will create some engagement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Peter Lee.
Yeah.